The Sterling Heights Hotel in Santa Monica was no stranger to high-profile guests. Celebrities, CEOs, and world travelers often passed through its grand lobby, drawn by its luxurious accommodations and impeccable service. On a Friday night, however, none of that mattered to Rachel, the front desk receptionist. After an exhausting 12-hour shift filled with demanding guests, misfiled reservations, and irate phone calls, she was running on nothing but caffeine and willpower. With her uniform slightly wrinkled and patience nearly depleted, she just wanted to get through the rest of her shift without any more problems. So when a scruffy-looking man in a hoodie and jeans walked into the lobby without luggage, Rachel barely glanced up. She had dealt with his type before. Last-minute walk-ins who either wanted a discount, an upgrade, or a favor. She was in no mood for negotiation. The man stepped up to the counter, his expression calm and composed. But Rachel didn't care. She gave him the same practiced, polite but firm smile she used for guests she wanted to dismiss quickly. "Good evening," the man said in a deep, gravelly voice. "I'd like to book a room for the night." Rachel barely glanced at her computer screen before responding, "Unfortunately, we're fully booked tonight, sir." She tapped at the keyboard as if confirming, though she already knew the answer she wanted to give. The man raised an eyebrow, looking around the bustling lobby. "Really? Not a single room?" "That's right," Rachel replied, her voice clipped. "It's been a busy night, but there's a motel a few blocks down. They might have availability." She watched his reaction closely. Usually this was the moment when guests would either accept defeat or start arguing. Instead, the man simply nodded. He didn't protest or beg. He just gave her an amused smile that made Rachel shift uncomfortably. "Got it," he said simply, and stepped away from the counter. Instead of leaving, however, he walked over to the seating area and sank into a chair in the corner of the lobby. Rachel watched him out of the corner of her eye. Why was he still here? Her irritation bubbled to the surface. She had turned him away. He should be heading to that dingy motel she suggested, not sitting in her lobby like he owned the place. Little did she know, he practically did. The man who had just been turned away wasn't just any random walk-in. He was Joe Rogan, comedian, former UFC commentator, and host of one of the most influential podcasts in the world. But tonight he wasn't Joe Rogan, the public figure. He was just Joe, a guy in need of a hotel room. His casual appearance, worn-out jeans, sneakers, and a faded hoodie, often made him blend in with regular people, which he liked. He had learned that when you strip away the glitz and glamour, you see the world for what it really is. He wasn't here for a PR stunt. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He just wanted a quiet place to stay before heading out the next morning for an event. But Rachel hadn't recognized him. To her, he was just another scruffy traveler who probably couldn't afford the Sterling Heights. Joe leaned back in his chair, quietly observing the lobby. He wasn't angry at Rachel. If anything, he found the whole thing fascinating. As a podcast host, Joe had spent years studying human nature, how people react under stress, how biases form, and how power dynamics play out in everyday situations. And now, he was watching it all unfold right in front of him. Rachel had judged him instantly, dismissing him based on nothing but his appearance. It wasn't personal. It was just how people operated. But what fascinated Joe the most was how unaware she was of her mistake. She had no idea that the man she had just turned away had interviewed some of the world's most powerful people, had a net worth in the hundreds of millions, and could probably buy this hotel if he felt like it. So he sat there, watching and waiting. Not out of spite, but out of curiosity. Because sometimes the best way to learn about people is to let them reveal themselves. Rachel had been working at Sterling Heights for 5 years, and in that time, she had developed a sixth sense about guests. She could usually tell within seconds whether someone was going to be an easy check-in or a headache. And tonight, she was too tired from headaches. The hotel was packed. VIP guests, weekend tourists, and business travelers filled the marble-floored lobby. The front desk had been bombarded all day with requests: extra pillows, room upgrades, complaints about the minibar prices. By the time the scruffy man in the hoodie walked in, Rachel had already dealt with more than her fair share of problems. So when he asked for a room, she didn't even bother checking. She had made a snap judgment, assuming he was another broke traveler looking for a deal. To her, he wasn't worth the extra effort. So she had sent him to a motel. And yet, he hadn't left. Rachel tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the guests who belonged there: men in suits, women with designer bags, travelers with sleek luggage. But every now and then, she glanced back at the man in the hoodie. Why was he still here? Was he just trying to make her uncomfortable? Was he planning to complain to management? She almost wanted to confront him, to ask why he hadn't left. But something about the way he sat there, calm, almost amused, made her uneasy. What was his deal? She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. The night was almost over and soon he would be gone. Or so she thought. Because tomorrow morning, she would wake up to a very different reality. One where the scruffy man she had dismissed wasn't just another traveler. He was the most powerful person in the room. Joe Rogan had always been fascinated by the way people treated him when they didn't recognize him. Over the years, he had built a reputation as one of the most influential voices in media. Yet without the stage lights and cameras, he often went unnoticed. And he liked it that way. Tonight was no different. Dressed in a faded hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, he looked nothing like the larger-than-life personality people knew from the internet. His shaved head and muscular build might have given away the fact that he was someone who took care of himself. But nothing about his appearance screamed celebrity. He had just wrapped up a long day. Meetings, a private dinner, and some last-minute event planning for a podcast taping happening the next morning. By the time he arrived at the Sterling Heights Hotel, all he wanted was a warm bed and a quiet place to crash. But as soon as he walked into the lobby, he sensed something was off. The receptionist barely looked at him. Most hotels greeted guests warmly, especially high-end ones like Sterling Heights. But Rachel, the woman behind the desk, didn't even glance up until he spoke. Her tone was professional but cold, detached, as if she had already decided he wasn't worth her time. Joe smirked to himself. He had seen this before. People making assumptions based on first impressions. He had talked about it on his podcast, joked about it in interviews, and even experienced it firsthand many times. What he hadn't expected was that he'd be turned away so quickly, without checking the system, without even pretending to see if a room was available. She had looked at him and made a decision instantly. This guy doesn't belong here. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated, but it was the first time in a while that it had happened this blatantly. Joe leaned against the counter, watching Rachel's face as she delivered the standard hotel rejection speech. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked tonight." Her voice was polite but final. Joe wasn't one to argue over small things, but something about the interaction amused him. "Fully booked, huh?" he repeated, nodding as if considering her words. "Not a single room left?" Rachel hesitated just for a second, maybe realizing that she had spoken too quickly, but she recovered fast. "That's right," she said. "Unfortunately, there's nothing available at the moment." Joe glanced at the computer screen. It was turned slightly away from him, but he could tell she hadn't even checked. "Interesting. All right," he said, rubbing his chin. "No worries." He could have told her who he was. He could have pulled out his phone and had his assistant book a room online in seconds. But he didn't. Instead, he let the moment play out. Rachel was already moving on, looking over his shoulder at a well-dressed couple approaching the counter. Joe chuckled. "Any recommendations for a place nearby?" he asked casually. Rachel brightened up slightly, happy to get rid of him. "There's a motel a few blocks down," she said, pointing in the general direction. "It's affordable and usually has rooms available." Joe smirked. A motel? He wasn't insulted, but the situation was too ridiculous not to find funny. The biggest podcaster in the world just got sent to a cheap motel. He almost wanted to pull out his phone and record this moment for his podcast. Instead, he just nodded and stepped away from the desk. "Thanks," he said, flashing a smile before turning toward the lounge area. Rachel let out a small sigh of relief, already shifting her attention to the next guest. She thought it was over, but Joe wasn't leaving just yet. Joe sat down in one of the plush lobby chairs, stretching out his legs as he watched people move through the grand space. He wasn't mad, just curious. Would Rachel figure it out? Would someone else recognize him first? Would she realize her mistake before it was too late? Joe glanced around. The hotel was filled with the usual crowd. Businessmen tapping away on laptops, tourists taking selfies, wealthy travelers chatting over expensive cocktails at the bar. Nobody had noticed him yet. But then, something interesting happened. A man in a tailored suit walked past, talking animatedly on his phone. Joe heard his name. "Yeah, Joe Rogan's supposed to be in town tonight. I think he's staying at the Sterling Heights." Joe grinned. The man continued walking, oblivious to the fact that the person he was talking about was sitting just a few feet away. Rachel, on the other hand, had definitely heard. Joe watched as her shoulders stiffened, her fingers pausing mid-typing on the keyboard. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes scanning the lobby. For the first time, she really looked at him. And in that moment, he saw the realization dawn in her eyes. Her lips parted slightly. Her expression shifted. Confusion, disbelief, and then panic. Joe met her gaze and raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. Rachel swallowed hard. She reached for the keyboard, quickly checking the system. A second later, she was on the phone, whispering urgently to someone in the back office. Joe laughed to himself. It was too late now. Rachel had dismissed him, judged him, and sent him packing, without ever realizing she had just humiliated one of the most influential figures in entertainment. A moment later, another hotel staff member, an older man in a suit, rushed over, his face pale as he leaned down to whisper something to Rachel. Joe could guess what was being said. Rachel's face turned red. Joe stretched his arms and stood up, walking leisurely back toward the front desk. "Hey," he said casually, leaning on the counter. "I was just about to head out, but I wanted to check. Any chance a room suddenly opened up?" Rachel's voice was shaky. "Mr. Rogan, I am so sorry. Joe waved a hand, cutting her off. "Relax," he said, laughing. "I'm just messing with you." Rachel looked like she wanted to disappear. At that moment, the hotel manager approached, apologizing profusely and insisting that they did have availability after all. Joe let them stumble over themselves for a while before finally accepting a room key. As he walked away, he turned back to Rachel with a grin. "Next time," he said, "maybe check the system first." Rachel nodded quickly, still too stunned to speak. Joe chuckled as he disappeared into the elevator. Lesson learned. Joe had always been naturally observant. Years of stand-up comedy and podcasting had trained him to notice the small things, the weird details that most people overlooked. Now, settled in one of the best suites in the Sterling Heights Hotel, he wasn't mad about the earlier situation. If anything, he was entertained. As he leaned back in a plush armchair near the lobby bar, sipping a whiskey, he let his eyes wander. The place was high-end, no doubt. Expensive chandeliers, sleek modern design, staff in pressed uniforms, moving with efficiency. It was the kind of hotel where the rich and powerful stayed, and Joe could tell just by watching the guests. At one table, a group of finance bros in tailored suits were discussing some startup deal, throwing around phrases like burn rate and scaling strategy. Near the entrance, a middle-aged couple was checking in, the wife excitedly pointing at a brochure for the hotel's spa while the husband nodded absently. clearly just along for the ride. And then, of course, there were the staff. Rachel, the receptionist who had dismissed him earlier, was still at the front desk, her demeanor noticeably different. She was nervous now, sneaking glances in Joe's direction, probably replaying her mistake in her head. Joe smirked. It wasn't personal, he got it. People judged all the time based on appearances, but he'd always been fascinated by how people changed when they realized who they were dealing with. He imagined discussing it on his podcast. You ever notice how people treat you differently when they think you're important? Like 1 minute, you're just some guy, and the next, they're bending over backwards. But here's the crazy part. It's all in their head. You didn't change. They did. He chuckled to himself, taking another sip of whiskey. But as he continued people-watching, something else caught his attention. A man, older, probably in his 60s, was moving through the lobby with a strange kind of purpose. Joe's instincts kicked in. This guy wasn't just another guest. There was something off about him. Joe had met all kinds of people in his life. Fighters, comedians, actors, politicians, people from every walk of life. He knew how to read body language, how to spot the subtle things that made a person interesting. And this guy, he was definitely interesting. The man was dressed well in a sharp gray suit, but there was an unease about him. His eyes darted around the lobby as if searching for someone, his posture tense. Joe noticed he wasn't carrying any luggage. Was he staying here? Or was he just here for someone else? Then the guy did something odd. He walked past the front desk twice. Each time he slowed down just a little, like he was listening in on conversations. Rachel, still shaken from her earlier mistake, barely noticed him. But Joe did. He leaned forward, pretending to check his phone while keeping the man in his peripheral vision. The guy wasn't looking at the front desk anymore. He was looking at him. Joe suppressed a grin. Here we go. The man hesitated for a second, then walked toward him. Excuse me, the man said in a low voice. But are you Joe Rogan? Joe looked up and gave a slow nod. Depends. Who's asking? The man glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. Big fan, he said quickly. I've got something I think you'd be interested in. Joe raised an eyebrow. This wasn't unusual. People pitched him stuff all the time. Business ideas, podcast topics, conspiracy theories. But something about this guy made Joe curious. He gestured to the seat across from him. Go on. The man hesitated, then sat down. He lowered his voice even further. Have you ever heard about the Sterling Heights incident? Joe tilted his head. Can't say I have. The man leaned in. It happened years ago, he whispered. A guest went missing, right from this hotel, no trace. And the weirdest part? The hotel never talked about it, covered the whole thing up. Joe's curiosity spiked. This was the kind of thing that made for a great podcast story. But before he could ask more, the man suddenly stiffened, looking toward the front desk. Joe followed his gaze. 2 hotel staff members were whispering to each other, and one of them, Rachel, had just picked up the phone. The man stood up abruptly. I shouldn't be talking about this, he muttered. Just be careful. And before Joe could say anything else, the man turned and walked out of the hotel. Joe watched him go, his mind racing. What the hell was that about? He had just come here to get a room, maybe get a good night's sleep. But now, this hotel had suddenly become a lot more interesting. The next morning, Joe woke up early, still thinking about the strange conversation from the night before. Has the guy been crazy? Or was there really something shady about this hotel? Either way, Joe wasn't done with it yet. He got dressed and headed down to the lobby. Something was different. The hotel staff was gathered in a small huddle near the front desk, whispering urgently. Even Rachel looked uneasy, her eyes darting toward the manager, who was speaking in a hushed but firm tone. Joe didn't have to be close to know something was up. He strolled over casually, pretending to check his phone, but keeping his ears open. Words floated through the air. Security footage disappeared overnight, can't explain it. Joe's interest sharpened. Was this about the strange guy from last night? Or something else entirely? Then the hotel manager cleared his throat, addressing the staff more firmly. "All right, listen up," he said. "No one talks about this to guests. We keep things running smoothly. Understand?" There were nods all around. Joe grinned to himself. Whatever was going on, they were trying to keep it quiet. And that only made him more curious. As he stepped forward, Rachel turned and saw him. For a second, she froze. Then, forcing a smile, she stepped away from the group and approached him. "Good morning, Mr. Rogan," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "How was your stay?" Joe studied her for a moment. "Oh, you know," he said casually. "Pretty quiet, though I did have an interesting conversation last night." Rachel's smile faltered just a little. "Did you?" Joe nodded, leaning in slightly. "Yeah. Some guy was telling me about a guest who went missing from this place." Rachel's face went pale. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she forced another smile. "That's just an old rumor," she said quickly. "Nothing to worry about." Joe chuckled. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I figured." But as he turned and walked away, he knew one thing for sure. This hotel had secrets, and he was just getting started. The tension in the hotel lobby was thick. Staff members whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting toward the manager, who was about to make an important announcement. Rachel stood at the front desk, her stomach twisting in knots. She still couldn't shake off the embarrassment from the night before. Turning away Joe Rogan, one of the most influential podcasters in the world, had been a massive mistake. And now, the entire staff seemed on edge, as if something even bigger was about to happen. The hotel manager cleared his throat. "All right, everyone, listen up," he began. "We have a special guest staying with us. Some of you may already be aware of this, but it's time for an official introduction." Rachel swallowed hard. "Please don't say it. Please don't say it." But then, the manager turned to his side and gestured. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Joe Rogan." A collective gasp spread through the staff. Whispers broke out instantly. And there he was, standing right next to the manager with his signature confident smirk. Rachel's heart sank. The man she had judged as some random drifter, the man she had dismissed without a second thought, was now standing in front of everyone as the VIP guest of the hotel. But then came the real shocker. The manager continued, "Not only is Mr. Rogan a guest here, but he's also considering a business partnership with our hotel chain. If things go well, this location could become one of the official venues for high-profile events under his brand." Rachel's jaw nearly dropped. Joe Rogan wasn't just staying here. He was potentially investing in this hotel. This was worse than she had imagined. She had turned away one of the most powerful voices in media, and now he was in a position of influence over her workplace. She wanted to disappear. Joe, however, was just watching the reactions, amused. He had seen this type of thing before, people realizing they had underestimated someone. And now Rachel had no choice but to face the consequences of her snap judgment. Rachel felt her hands tremble as she stepped forward. "Mr. Rogan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to apologize for last night." Joe raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, allowing her to continue. I made a huge mistake. I misjudged you," she admitted, her cheeks burning with shame. "I didn't recognize you, but that's no excuse. I should have treated you with respect, no matter who you were." Joe crossed his arms, nodding slightly. Rachel felt like she needed to say more. "The truth is," she continued, "I've worked here for years, and I guess I've gotten used to making snap judgments about people. It's just part of the job sometimes. But I realize now that I was wrong, and I'm really, really sorry." Joe finally spoke. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've met a lot of people in my life. Some good, some bad. But the ones I remember most are the ones who own up to their mistakes." Rachel held her breath. "You messed up," Joe said bluntly. "But here's the thing. We all do. What matters is what you learn from it." Rachel nodded eagerly. Joe glanced at the rest of the staff, who were still watching closely. "This is a lesson for everyone," he continued. "You never know who you're talking to. You never know what someone's story is. That's why you should treat everyone with respect, not just celebrities, not just people in suits. Everyone." Rachel felt her chest tighten. He wasn't scolding her. He was teaching her something valuable. And she knew he was right. The rest of the hotel staff stood quietly, absorbing Joe's words. Even the manager, who had worked in the industry for decades, seemed to be reflecting on the message. Joe continued, "I've seen this happen before. People make snap judgments based on appearances. Sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes it costs them big opportunities. But the real test is whether you learn from it." Rachel felt her eyes sting with emotion. "I do want to learn from this," she said softly. "I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." Joe studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good," he said, "because respect and humility, those will take you farther than any job title ever will." Rachel let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. And just like that, the weight of her mistake started to lift. Joe wasn't holding a grudge. He wasn't here to ruin her career. He was here to teach her something, and she would never forget it. The days following Joe Rogan's stay at the hotel were different. Rachel felt like a new person. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was present. She was aware. Every time a guest walked in, she reminded herself, treat them with kindness. Treat them with respect. You never know who they really are. She noticed her interactions changing. A tired business traveler, frustrated after a long flight, she greeted him with patience instead of matching his frustration. An elderly woman struggling with her bags, she called for assistance right away instead of waiting to be asked. She even started listening to Joe Rogan's podcast, not just for entertainment, but for the deep conversations, the way he always looked for different perspectives, the way he asked questions instead of assuming. And then one afternoon, the hotel manager called her into his office. She expected the worst. Instead, he smiled. "Rachel," he said, "I've noticed a change in you." She swallowed hard. I've been trying." "Well, it shows," he said. "And because of that, I want to offer you something." She blinked in surprise. "We have an opening for a senior position," he continued. "It's more responsibility, but I think you're ready for it." Rachel felt her heart skip a beat. A promotion? After everything that had happened? After everything that had happened? She could barely find the words. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," the manager said with a smile. Rachel took a deep breath, and then she nodded. "Yes, absolutely." As she walked out of the office, she realized something. One night, one mistake, one lesson, and it had changed everything. She had misjudged a stranger, and in return, that stranger had changed her life.